Welcome into Geek Therapy Radio today, the Geek Therapy Radio podcast. I'm your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger. That's Hamburger with all E's. Oh, the names that I got called growing up. Cheeseburger, hamburger. Most people still think it's hamburger. And you know what, whatever. Just roll with it. But no, hamburger, all E's. Today is August 27th. 2019. I usually like to keep these things evergreen, meaning that there's no date or timestamp on it. The music you heard on the intro here, the bed music, was from the Gameboy Camera. So, as I say, the meat and potatoes of this podcast is going to be talking about and reminiscing mainly, really just reminiscing about the Gameboy Camera. The outro music is also going to be other music from the Gameboy Camera cartridge. I just wanted to mention real quick, though. I mentioned the date, August 27th, 2019. It was on this day in 1990, August 27th, that we lost a blues legend, Stevie Ray Vaughan. And I always have marked the day because I know it's 2 days after my birthday. It was 2 days after my 7th birthday, August 27th, 1990, that Stevie Ray Vaughan did his final concert and died in a heliplane. I was going to say heliplane. I was legitimately going to say a heliplane crash. Heliplane. He died in a helicopter crash. Oh, it's so sad. You can't go to a blues festival or a blues concert now without shedding a tear at least once, because everybody in the crowd knows that Stevie should be there. Stevie should be up there. Buddy Guy is still alive, thank God. He's in his 80s and he's still just kicking butt. Buddy Guy is a living legend. Buddy Guy is a blues god that influenced and who Stevie Ray tried to emulate and Eric Clapton tried to emulate, that even Jimi Hendrix would emulate Buddy Guy. Buddy Guy is a living legend. I know maybe a ton of people haven't heard of him, not to pull my hipster glasses up my nose, but I'm just saying, in pop culture, Buddy Guy isn't the first name that comes to mind when you're thinking about music. If you're into the blues, then you absolutely, yes, of course you know who Buddy Guy is. I'm just saying Buddy Guy influenced a lot of blues players, a lot of guitar players, period, and he's still around. But on this day in 1990, August 27th, 1990, Stevie Ray Vaughan left us, and it's a very sad thing to go to blues concerts and blues festivals, because you know that Stevie should be there. So I just wanted to mention that for my blues geeks. Pay homage to SRV. Maybe I should have played Stevie Ray songs for this segment. I'm going to go with Gameboy Camera. I'll probably do a Stevie Ray tribute on the Geek Therapy Radio show this weekend. But anyways, the Gameboy Camera is what I really wanted to talk about today. I've mentioned the Gameboy Camera. I've probably done a segment on the Game Boy. No, actually. I'm sure I've mentioned it on my radio show. I did an entire video few years ago about the Gameboy Camera on the YouTube channel, and I filmed it entirely using a Gameboy Camera. And yes, it's horrible. I'm not saying the video is horrible, but the Gameboy Camera footage is not great given its limited capabilities. So I just wanted to get into a little bit of the history and reminisce, look back fondly at the Gameboy Camera. It was released in 1998, and I remember that it was released in 1998 because I bought the Game Boy Pocket in 1998 along with the Game Boy Camera. The Game Boy Pocket, I believe, came out in 1996, the same year as the Nintendo 64. So that's an interesting side note, that the Game Boy Camera, being released in 1998, came out 2 years after the Nintendo 64. The Game Boy Color was released in 1998, and it was more supposed to coincide and be used with the Game Boy Camera. Even though the Game Boy Camera was not a color camera, it was fun to add color to it with the Game Boy Color. I got a Game Boy Color, I think that Christmas of 1998, I want to say. Maybe it was 1999, a year after. You'll have a much better time using the Game Boy Camera with the Game Boy Color because the Game Boy Color had a TFT active matrix screen. It was a lot sharper and more crisp than the LCD screen of the original Game Boy. Either the puke green screen of the original fat Game Boy brick or the much better, sharper and crisper, but still milky nonetheless, screen of the Game Boy Pocket. I used the Game Boy Camera most of the time with my Game Boy Pocket. I had a blue Game Boy Pocket, and again, you can see this in the YouTube video if you search back through the videos long enough a few years ago. Blue Game Boy Pocket paired with a green Game Boy Camera, and I thought that color combination went well together. And I had loads of fun with my Game Boy Camera, and I also later, just a little later, a few months later, got the Game Boy printer, which printed terrible pictures of the terrible photos taken by the Game Boy Camera. And I say terrible because I'm putting it into a modern context, and as I reminisce, you'll see that I have very, very fond memories with my Game Boy Camera. So the Game Boy Camera sensor was the pixel rating was 128 by 128. It was a CMOS sensor, and it could store 128 by 112 pixel black and white digital images on the 4-color Game Boy palette, basically the 4 shades of gray. So did you catch that? My phone, my Galaxy Note 9, what is it? It's a 1440 screen. It's like 2,000 something by 1440 pixels. It's absolutely insane. The Game Boy Camera was 128 by 128 pixels, and the pictures that it saved were 128 by 112 pixels. If someone told you today that a screen has a phone screen had a PPI, a pixels per inch of 128, that would be an atrocious, blocky, pixelated mess. That's how we would think of it in modern days. The Game Boy Camera the total image size was 128 by 112. So it was already cropping out some pixels from the 128 by 128 perfectly square 1:1 aspect ratio sensor. So, yes, the photos that the Game Boy Camera took were very grainy. And it's hard to think in modern times, looking back to the Game Boy Camera, that we got such a level of enjoyment with it. I can tell you firsthand that when I think about the Game Boy Camera, it fills my heart with warmth and joy. I probably played with the Game Boy Camera more than any other video game on the Game Boy, period. Just the amount of time that the Game Boy Camera just resided in my Game Boy Pocket, and I still have both of them. I still have the camera and the Game Boy Pocket. I still have both of those things that I bought back in 1998. I spent so much time with it. I would do time lapse. There are so many different functions and fun things you could do with the camera. A quick side note, by the way, the Game Boy Camera was developed by Game Freak and Creatures, the same company that developed Pokemon around the same time, no less. So that's a little tidbit of information I think not a ton of people know, is that the same people who made Pokemon brought us the Game Boy Camera. And by the way, Game Freak also brought us the people who made Pokemon also brought us one of my other favorite games on the Nintendo DS, Meteos. If you go back and play Meteos, and I'll get back to the Game Boy Camera in a moment, but if you go and play Meteos on the Nintendo DS, it is a very similar kind of overall feel and language, so to speak, as far as huge orchestras and very animated and a lot of character, with Super Smash Brothers. So, that's all the same studio. It's all the same Pokemon studio. So if you have never played Meteos on the Nintendo DS, I highly suggest you go play it. It's basically like Super Smash Brothers Tetris is what I can kind of equate it to. It is very well done. The soundtracks are huge. The characters are very simple but very lovable. So I love Meteos on Nintendo DS. I highly suggest you go back and play it, or play it for the first time. So that same company, drawing it all the way back to the Game Boy Camera and my enjoyment of the Game Boy Camera. And it wasn't just my enjoyment of the Game Boy Camera. I wasn't alone in this. But I can only tell you from my perspective that the Game Boy Camera was absolute magic. As a matter of fact, at the time, it was the world's smallest and one of the world's only, consumer or affordable digital cameras. Yes, digital cameras existed in 1998. You can store the images on floppy drives, and image quality always was terrible. But the Game Boy Camera was definitely, for a little while, held the title of the world's smallest digital camera. And it was one of the world's most affordable digital cameras. It was not over $100. I think it was priced the same as any other Game Boy cartridge, more or less. It might have been $80. I don't recall it being much more than $60 for the Game Boy Camera. I think the Game Boy Pocket at the time cost a cool even $100 or $99.99 or whatever. I bought both at Best Buy in Humble, Texas. So anyways, using the Game Boy Camera was magic, and I still think of it as magic. I still have very fond feelings for it, because I'll say it like this. You know, earlier in this podcast, I've been saying that the Game Boy Camera looks terrible because we're putting it into a modern context with our smartphones, and our phones are 24 megapixel cameras and really good lenses in there. But back at the time, I think it was just that we had nothing else really to compare it to on the digital side of things. Because even, like I said, digital cameras were few and far between, and even their pictures were pretty terrible. But really, if I can be bold, and I don't think it's any stretch to the imagination to say this, what really I think was happening, why we thought the Game Boy Camera was so cool, and why we still think of it as like a magical time to be alive. It really was a magical time to be growing up with technology. Is that, yes, by modern standards, the pictures 128 by 112 pixels on a little tiny black and white screen. The reason why it was so great, it all boils down to, I think we had a lot more imagination back then. And I'll just let that sink in for a second. Yes, things look blocky and pixelated, but it was magic because of our imagination filled in the gaps. And it filled in the gaps wonderfully. I don't recall, it was a shock to my system when I went back to revisit the Game Boy Camera that the images actually looked that bad, because as a kid, I don't remember them looking that bad. I remember taking pictures, really, really well-lit pictures out in the yard and things like that of, in my imagination, what I remembered, or I thought I remembered, were very sharp, very crisp, really neat, well-defined pictures in my mind. But that had to be my imagination filling in the gaps. And it was just astonishing to take pictures whenever I wanted without having to wait to get film developed or asking Dad to borrow the camera or anything like that. I could just go out and take pictures. And if you plugged it into your Super Game Boy and your Nintendo, if you plugged it into your Super Game Boy on the Nintendo and then on the Super Nintendo, and then plugged the Super Nintendo into a VCR, you had a video camcorder. It was not very good, but you could still record video, no audio, but video onto a VHS tape by using the Game Boy Camera in a Super Game Boy going into the Super Nintendo and out through a VCR recording to a VHS tape. You had a video camera that you could use all the time without wanting to, or bugging your dad to borrow the VHS camcorder. So much fun, so much stop motion, little stop motion films. You can only store up to 30 images on the Game Boy Camera, so you had to be frugal with it. And the way we would save it for the future, which wound up being a bad idea, was printing them out with a Game Boy Camera. It was a heat printer, just kind of like how most receipts are printed. And that ish would fade. That ish would fade quickly. So if you printed out a roll of 30, or however the printer sounded, you know what I'm talking about, how those heat printers sound. It would not save the pictures for long. They were stickers. The back of that printer paper was adhesive, so you could stick those pictures wherever you wanted. I put them on school books and binders and things like that in my locker, but they would be faded by the end of the year. I love the Game Boy Camera. You could use the Game Boy printer to print off other things. I think you could use it to print off stuff from Zelda Link's Awakening, if I'm not mistaken. Or was it Link's Awakening? I know there were some games on the Nintendo Game Boy that if you plugged in the printer, you could print off different screens. Ooh, you could do it with Super Mario Brothers Deluxe on the Game Boy Color. I remember that. Super Mario Brothers Deluxe was basically a port of the original Super Mario Brothers, full color port. The frame was cropped a bit awkwardly sometimes, but it was still really fun. But as you played and progressed, you would earn different images in your gallery in Super Mario Brothers Deluxe, and then you could print those off in the Game Boy printer, and they looked really good. It was very sharp and very crisp and very defined. It was still black and white, but you could print off a Goomba or something like that, and it would totally look like a Goomba versus taking a selfie of yourself with a Game Boy Camera and printing it off, and people, what is that? What is that splotch? That's me! That's me! So anyways, memory lane with Game Boy Camera. If you had a Game Boy Camera, I am desperate to hear from you about your memories with the Game Boy Camera. geektherapy@iheartmedia.com. That's the email. Enter it into your brain mush. geektherapy@iheartmedia.com. And please tell me about your Game Boy Camera memories, or your Game Boy memories in general. What was your favorite Game Boy game? That's going to do it for today's podcast. Thank you for listening. Be good to yourselves and others. Remember that we're all geeks about something, so embrace your inner geek. And with that, I'll talk to you next time. Take care.